Hello, and welcome to an exciting journey through the eyes of Marvin and Bernard Kalb, two of the most respected broadcast journalists of our time. Over a period of 70 years, these two brothers reported some of the world's most historic events and witnessed firsthand some of our nation's most turbulent moments. Marvin Kalb was a diplomatic correspondent for CBS and NBC News for 30 years. In the 1980s, he anchored Meet the Press. He also anchored the Kalb Report, a quarterly broadcast from the National Press Club, emphasizing journalistic ethics and practice. He has authored and co-authored 14 books, including his most recent, The Road to War, Presidential Commitments Honored and Betrayed. Today, Marvin Kalb is a senior advisor to the Pulitzer Center on Crisis Reporting and senior fellow at the Brookings Institution. He is a professor of journalism at Harvard University. Bernard Kalb started as a reporter and columnist for the New York Times before he branched out into TV journalism at CBS and NBC News. He was a foreign correspondent for 15 years, covering Southeast Asia during the Vietnam War. Bernard Kalb's career as a journalist took him to locations around the world, including Washington, Moscow, Beijing, Saigon, Paris, Antarctica, and many places in between. These two brothers have some wonderful stories to tell that will be both entertaining and educational. So sit back and prepare to take a journalistic journey as the Johns Hopkins Osher School of Lifelong Learning and Montgomery College's TV and radio students proudly present The Brothers Kalb, Here, There, and Everywhere, a lecture series that recounts the globe-trotting professional experiences of Marvin and Bernard Kalb.
CBS News diplomatic correspondent Marvin Kalb.
This is Mao Zedong, undisputed
The
master
Pope
of
slump,
communist China.
hit by two
Agreement
bullets.
reduces the risk of war. Do you agree or disagree?
Probably be for the last time. Marvin Kalb, CBS News.
We started, as you remember, with the Cuban Missile Crisis. We then went on to the Vietnam War. We then went on last week to the opening to China. And what we want to do now is talk about the Middle East today. Now, the Middle East as a function of the Cold War has to be understood as competition for a part of the world between two superpowers. And the United States believed after World War II that this was a region of the world because of oil supplies going back and forth, that this was our region of the world. We were in control of it. But in September of 1955, the Russians moved in with a major arms deal with the Egyptians. And when they did that, that opened the door in a very dramatic way to the competition, direct competition between the two superpowers for control of this critical part of the world. And I have to tell you that for me, and I think for Bernie as well, one person seemed at a certain moment in the history of our relationship in that part of the world, one person, namely Henry Kissinger, seemed to personify the effort on the part of one side to try to elbow out the other side. And his strategy from the very beginning was that you don't get into a war with the Russians, that is unacceptable, but you use what is on the ground. And in 1973, it was very much the result of the 1973 war between Israel and a number of Arab countries. And Kissinger's idea from the very beginning was use what was on the ground to your advantage to advance your own interests. And so for us, Henry Kissinger was a kind of major figure whom we both covered. What I would like to do is explain the context in which Kissinger traveled. He was dealing essentially with two psyches, two historical backgrounds. With the Arabs, he was dealing with a group of people who were in the first flush of feeling a deep sense of Arab nationalism and a belief that it was their time on the world stage. They had oil, yes, but they also, looking back 6 and 7 centuries, back to a time when Arabs did lead in intellectual pursuits in mathematics, algebra, a whole lot of things, and they would take great pride in pointing this out to anyone who traveled in the Arab world. And Kissinger would hear all of this a lot. He was also dealing with Israel, which, as you all know, is a very small state in a hostile neighborhood, and it consisted of people, many of whom, if they did not know of the Holocaust personally, knew of it through family connections. They felt very much as if the world is not an engaging, warm, hospitable place for us. And Kissinger himself, a product of that very sentiment, that very belief, but nevertheless traveling there as the Secretary of State, the first Jewish Secretary of State of the United States, he had to be balanced. He had to be, quote, objective in the way in which he dealt with both sides. I remember once in 1975, when there was, during the Ford administration, something called a reassessment of policy, meaning a reassessment of U.S.-Israel policy. And when the White House put out that word, it was intended to frighten the Israelis into making more concessions in order to get a deal. At that time, I believe it was with Jordan. And we were briefed, as you saw, that kind of briefing on the plane. And when the briefing was over, he or one of his aides grabbed me in the back and pulled me back while the others left. And it was just the two of us in the part of the plane up in the front. And he said, "Do you have a question for me?" And I knew he plays games all the time. And I knew that what he was getting at was the reassessment, and he wanted me to push him. And what I did was ask him questions about, are you intending in this reassessment, once again, to, remember he said as a joke before that the Israelis always think I'm betraying them? I said, are you interested in a betrayal? Is that what you're getting at here? In a nice way, of course, but that's what it ends up. Not at all, and I believe to this day, I saw tears forming in a corner of his eye when he said, I will never, ever, as Secretary of State, take an action that will hurt the state of Israel. I will only take an action that I believe truly is in the interest of Israel, though the Israeli leaders themselves may not buy into that. There was always that kind of conflict. And I want very briefly to discuss or describe really how the sense of betrayal began. Right after the 1956 war, the Egyptians who had been in control of the Strait of Tiran, which controls access to the Gulf of Aqaba, a major Israeli port, through which the Israelis got their oil. So it was terribly important to them. When the war was over, the Egyptians did not pull back until they were under severe Israeli pressure, ultimately did, and the Israelis occupied what has since been called Arab land. And the Arabs insisted that they will not make a deal ending the 56 war formally unless the Israelis pulled out. Eisenhower, our president at that time, agreed with the Arabs. And he said, Israel, you've got to get out. And Ben-Gurion, then prime minister, said, no, we're not going to get out until such time as you either allow us back in or get the United Nations to go in, but the Egyptians we will not allow back in. As a result of a lot of terribly difficult negotiating between the U.S. and Israel, one of the worst times in that relationship parenthesis, until perhaps right now, close paren, but we'll get to that. Eisenhower went on television, the only time this has ever happened, primetime television, to criticize Israel and to demand that Israel pull out. And again, Ben-Gurion said no. The Israelis always believe that they've got to have one major power with them. They cannot be alone in a major confrontation. In order to settle the deal, Eisenhower sent a letter to Ben-Gurion in which he said, "The United States recognizes your right to access to Aqaba. In addition, the United States would be prepared to take action in support of the exercise of your right." Well, that was terribly important to the Israelis. They put it in their hip pocket, and they were very comforted by the fact that the U.S. was there in writing, in a presidential letter, and that was terribly important. 10 years later, 1967, what did the Egyptians do? They moved right back into Tehran, right back into Bloc Aqaba, and the Israelis, very upset and anxious to engage in a preemptive action against Egypt, sent Abba Eban to talk to President Johnson. And Eban had a copy of the Eisenhower letter in his hip pocket. And he went to see Johnson and, "Mr. President, we have your America's support that Aqaba must be open to Israeli shipping." Johnson said he had never heard of the Eisenhower letter. And Dean Russ said he had never heard of the Eisenhower letter. But the Israelis had the letter. And at that time, they sent Walt Rostow up to Gettysburg to pick up a copy. And they got the letter. They showed it to Johnson. Johnson, who was a great supporter of Israel, said to Eban, "You know that I am one of your buddies," my word that is, "that I am one of your great supporters. But please understand, I am now deeply engaged in the war in Vietnam. I want very much to get our Great Society program endorsed by Congress. I cannot go to them right now and ask for support that might lead to an American military engagement in another part of the world. So I recommend that we go to the UN and talk to them." And Eban said, "Not the UN. No, please. Spare me the UN. I've been there, thank you." And Johnson had no other way around that, and Eban pressed him. And Johnson said to him, the United States will always be with you if you do not act on your own. In other words, preemptive action you can do, but we cannot support. That is exactly what the Israelis did. They acted preemptively and succeeded in having a stunning success. The Six-Day War, it ended with the Israelis in control of much of what they have today, except in the Sinai, which they have given up. Now,
let me talk for a minute and interrupt.
One thing. No, you can't interrupt. One thing. Because it's a terribly important point, and it has to do right now with the problem with Iran. The Israelis believed and believe that a presidential letter, no matter which president sends it, is American policy. It's not just a fan letter from a president to a country. It is the policy of the United States when articulated by a president. That is the Israeli view. The American view is, yes, that's true on occasion, but a president always has the right to change his mind. And if one president says A, and the next president comes in and says, I'm not so sure about that, it ought to be B, the Israelis are astonished by that because they believe a presidential letter is the policy, but it isn't. And the greatest proof of that was in 2004. There was a deal between the Israeli Prime Minister Ariel Sharon and President George W. Bush, in which Bush essentially accepted the Israeli view on any negotiation. He was very, very tight. And when the Obama administration came in, Hillary Clinton, in one of her first news conferences, was asked about that, and she said every administration has its right to follow, to pursue, to create its own policy, meaning that the Bush letter to Sharon is an interesting part of history. Bernardo.
Yeah, I just wanted to add, Marvin, all true what you said. Not surprised, are you? All true what you said, but the idea of this program, as we said at the very outset, is you're all familiar with the headlines of our times, but we wanted to personalize some of those headlines to tell you what it felt when you're close up to the headline and see some of the details. For example, Marvin alluded to the agreement signed ultimately, the Sinai Agreement between the United States and Egypt. And at that time, we were on what they called a diplomatic shuttle. Marvin was on for 22 days between Israel and Syria. 22 days of back.
More than that.
Well, whatever. But I was on some of the more miniature diplomatic shuttles. I used to have one hotel room in Cairo, and I had a hotel room at the King David. And sometimes I visit Israel twice a day, because Kissinger would pick up a phrase or two of what he hoped was a concession from Begin, let us say, and carry it to Sadat and take Sadat's response back to Begin. So you did not know what night, where you'd be sleeping, what night on the diplomatic shuttle. And on one of these occasions, when they in fact signed the Sinai Agreement of fixing the line after the 73 war, I was on that trip with Kissinger. And when the Israelis signed the document, Rabin signed the document, and I'd known him slightly here in Washington, I went up with the document, and I wanted it as a bit of history to remember, and I asked Rabin to sign the document. He did. 2 hours later, we were in Cairo, and there was Sadat talking about the agreement. And I got out of my front row seat to move to Sadat to get his signature, and I was out of my seat about 2 seconds when about 65 Egyptian security men pounced on me, very anxious, and quite rightly so, what to do. During that period, well, I never got Sadat's signatures, the bottom line on that. But during that time, we were also interested what was the views of the PLO. Now, in a minute, we'll give you a view of the PLO, but I was on the Kissinger plane when he went from Jerusalem to Cairo, and then we went to Jordan. We were traveling around the Middle East with Kissinger briefing the various countries as to the details and significance of the signature on a fixed line in the Sinai. And I got a message in one of the stops to get off the plane in Beirut to do a face the nation with Arafat. So, in fact, the Kissinger plane stopped in Beirut, and I got off the airplane in Jordan. I got off the airplane in Jordan and took a short flight to Beirut. And New York, CBS New York, told me that they had already arranged for Face the Nation with Arafat's people. All I had to do was get to Beirut, and you'll be met there somehow or another, and you'll be taken to where the Face the Nation program would be taped that day, flying immediately to New York and being shown the next morning on Face the Nation. So those were my instructions. Now, you remember, subsequently, we heard what happened to Danny Pearl of the Wall Street Journal when he took a mission like that, and it turned out to be fatal. I was too naive, and thank God I escaped. But anyway, so I went to the hotel that they told me to go. I think it was the hotel, it was not the King George, it's the Hotel Palestina or something there. And I wandered around the lobby waiting to be discovered. While I was waiting, I bought a few fake antiques. And I'm waiting. I bought something that was manufactured 2 weeks ago that was from 1300 BC. I waited, and then somebody came and tapped me on the shoulder and they said, "Are you so-and-so?" I said, "Yes." He said, "Then come with me." The sort of things we do. I got into the car. Oh, I got it. Is it that interesting? I got into the car with this gentleman representing the Palestinians, And off we went to the Palestinian camps. We went into some sort of apartment building. We went to the 3rd or 5th floor. We were taken into some apartment, and I got a very nice, how do you do, like in coffee and so forth. And when I got there, of course, the living room was all set up with cameras and lights and whatnot. The host and hostess were very nice. I took my seat. There were 2 other correspondents that had been designated by CBS to join me on the panel. They were Bill McLaughlin of CBS News, I'm sure you remember Bill, and Arno de Borgrov of Newsweek. And Arno was the ultimate authority on the Middle East, certainly in his own mind. One little interesting story that goes with this book. When the book came out in 1974, he was still in office. This is a rare thing in a way. He was still in office. And inevitably, the publisher, Little Brown, threw a big party here in Washington, hoping to stimulate buzz about the book and sell the book and whatnot, and was held at the Madison Hotel. And as you can imagine, as you could predict, the diplomatic corps members were all invited and so forth. They all knew Kissinger would eventually turn up at this party, and the press was there, and there were dozens, scores of people wandering around in this reception, and finally Kissinger came in, gathered around them. Question, Mr. Secretary, what do you think of the book? And he said, in the rumble, he said, he hadn't yet had time to read it, but he loved the title. You can pick it up now.
He was quite a guy to run around with. And I must say, speaking for myself only, I learned a great deal about diplomacy and a great deal about the Middle East. And one of the things that we all came upon was the recognition of how difficult it was to try to bring the Israelis and the Arabs together on just about anything. But Kissinger did manage between 1973 and 75 to have a series of disengagement agreements, first with the Egyptians, then with the Jordanians, and then later on with President Carter, and we may even have a picture of that, or some of the pictures of Kissinger running around kissing people left and right, which you do a lot of in the Middle East. And we ended up at that point when Jimmy Carter, as president, was able to bring Menachem Begin, the Prime Minister of Israel, Anwar Sadat, President of Egypt, to Camp David, and after 13 days of intensive negotiations, any number of times breaking down, being reconstituted at breakfast time, they did reach an agreement, and it was the first agreement establishing peace in a treaty between Israel and an Arab country. And that was with Egypt, and then later on there was a similar agreement with Jordan, and both of those peace treaties exist to this day.
No, I was going to ask about the resonance of Kissinger as Secretary of State. If I were to ask you, and you don't have to answer this question, just answer yourself. If I were to ask you, name 3 Secretaries of State, 2 since Kissinger, do you have any difficulty excavating those names? No difficulty. How about 3, 4? My point is that the Kissinger resonance in the particular period he was in office was extraordinary compared to the resonance of the succeeding Secretaries of State. And when he came in, he had the good or the bad fortune to come in at a time when American policy needed a little adrenaline. There were 4 major things that had to be looked at carefully. Establishing some sort of détente with the Soviet Union, opening up China, finding some solution for the Middle East, and doing something about the control of the atom. And on all 4 points, he elevated and produced foreign policy, always in the interest of the United States, and reconciling that you had to trade a few corners here and there with the gentleman on the other side of the table. Even by 74, I just wanted to read something in the book and come up with these adjectives that were describing Kissinger during that particular period when he bounced around the world with the predictable flamboyance and drama, his one-liners, power is the ultimate aphrodisiac. He had extraordinary. And here's just on our first page of our book, Kissinger is described as, among other things, the second most powerful man in the world, the conscience of the administration, official apologist, compassionate hawk, vigilant dove, Dr. Strangelove, the playboy of the Western Wing, Nixon's Metternich, Nixon's secret agent, the President of the United States, the Jackie Onassis of the Nixon administration, Nobel warrior, Mideast cyclone, reluctant wiretapper, Secretary of the World, and subsequently, because of additional information that has come out about Kissinger and has been incorporated in future biographies after ours in '74, vile creature, a war criminal, etc. The whole gamut from A to Z on portraits of Kissinger, crystallized in a word or a phrase or two, is there for him. From rhapsodic adjectives to the talents of Kissinger to being a war criminal, a vile creature, etc. The whole range is there for Kissinger. When he himself does the arithmetic on what he did, he probably smacks his lips in some kind of appreciation, because it was a particular era. We had one Secretary of State, who shall remain nameless, who was making a trip to the Middle East at one of the critical times, and he had never been to the Middle East before. So we comforted him. We said, Mr. Secretary, don't worry, we'll show you around. We reporters will show you around. But, you know, Kissinger, despite the various adjectives, both the pluses and minuses, and there are many minuses, was on a first-name basis with history. And when we traveled with Kissinger, compared to some of the other secretaries of state, who may also have put forth policies that were perfect for the United States, you had a feeling that they had learned the details 15 minutes earlier, where Kissinger, you had a feeling, was working out of the depths of history, appreciating the psychology of nations in conflict with the United States, and seeking to drain the information he had into workable philosophies in dealing with these other strange people on the other side of the table.
I'm uncomfortable with some of that, and I have to share that. I'm uncomfortable with it because Kissinger was working at a particular moment in history, and it was arranged, almost prearranged, for that kind of skill. But in 1979, the Ayatollah Khomeini took over in Iran.
But wait a minute.
And this is important.
Why are you uncomfortable with what I said?
I am uncomfortable because it conveys an impression that Kissinger would have been even successful in the new period of the Middle East, when the Iranians occupied a position totally different from what the Shah had occupied.
In other words, you're not uncomfortable, you're how to put it, amplifying my comments.
Only in the most respectful manner.
In that sense, continue.
I think it's extremely important here that in 1979, when the Ayatollah Khomeini took over, representing a Shia victory as he saw it over the Sunni majority in the Arab world, it unleashed just the kind of terrorist trench warfare that the United States is involved in ever since. And to even imagine that one person as Secretary of State or one president could really turn that kind of history around, I imagine would have been almost impossible, because you were dealing with somebody, the Ayatollah Khomeini, who truly believed at the time that he took power in Iran that he was riding a wave of history that would establish a global caliphate, and that he would be in charge of it all, and that he would occupy the dominant position in the Islamic world. And anybody who did not agree with him was regarded as a traitor to Islam and an enemy of history and had to be attacked. He felt he was in the forefront of history. Anybody, even a Muslim, who disagreed with him was bad, was somebody who was trying to hold back what was inevitable because God had said so. You're introducing now a totally, it's not new in history, but new to our history, our lifetimes, where people actually believed that they had an inside track to God, that God was on their side, that they could do anything, which we now translate as terrorism, in order to advance their interests. And I remember at the time being absolutely shocked and maybe in my naivete believing that this man could not really be serious. But I have to tell you that in subsequent years and reading a lot more about him and trying to understand what is happening, we are now seeing a part of the world that Kissinger might not have been able to come up with any grand strategies and formulas. And I am filled with admiration for our current Secretary of State, who is at least making a determined effort to try to begin to turn things around. It is not easy. In fact, it is almost impossible. And let us take for just a moment, as a way of sort of breaking down the current setup in the Middle East, and start with the Obama administration and what it is that Obama has had to work with. The first thing he's had to work with is the Israelis. There's no question that the Obama relationship with Prime Minister Netanyahu has been, to put it most charitably, strained, and they barely get along, but for the television cameras, manage to appear to be on the same page. There's then the issue of Syria, and there's then the issue right now of Iran. And when Obama came in, he was, as with many other aspects of both the man and his policy, he was filled with the belief that the world is there for him to conquer, and that he has both the intelligence as well as that moment in history that he can grab and run with to be able to turn things around. The problem was that the Middle East marches to its own drummer. And it is simply not that impressed with the President of the United States. And you see what happened with 2 years ago when the so-called Arab Spring began. We were then caught up in a totally new, unexpected phenomenon. Dennis Ross told us that when he was at the White House on the day that the Arab Spring began in Tunisia, he was there with 26 leaders of the Arab world, and he asked the question to all of them, do you believe that there is anything on the near horizon that will change the Arab world, that will break the patterns that we've been working with now for a couple of decades? And he went around the room and they all said no, that there was nothing that was going to happen. And that evening, it began to happen. So the White House was taken totally by surprise on this, because Dennis was sitting right there with the president on Middle East policy. And the president dealing with the Israelis, I mentioned before about that exchange of letters, the Eisenhower and then on up to Johnson. I had the privilege, truly, and I relish this, of having had the opportunity for long conversations with Golda Meir, Menachem Begin, and Yitzhak Rabin. And I would ask them this question of betrayal, because they always would use that word when they were discussing a relationship with the United States. And I would say, when they raised this, how can you possibly say that? The United States is your best friend. We provide you with arms, we provide you with money, we provide you with diplomatic support at the UN. We have done everything for Israel. How can you speak about betrayal? And each one, in a totally different context, each one said the same thing. And they all went back to the experience with the Eisenhower letter. And they said that was the initial betrayal, and there will be others. And they would always say, we love the United States. It's our greatest friend. But at the end of the day, on an issue of vital national security interest to Israel, it will be we Israelis who will do the fighting. Rabin even added on a number of occasions, we don't want anyone else to do the fighting. We'll do it ourselves. Begin never did that, and Golda never did that. They both spoke in terms of a desire for the United States to help out militarily. Rabin always said, give us the weapons and we'll do it ourselves. But at the end of the day, they expected only Israel to support Israel.
We hope you enjoyed this edition of the Brothers Kalb, Here, There, and Everywhere. Join us again next time for an up-close and personal view of the unforgettable events that shaped our nation and the world. And remember, you can always join the conversation on Facebook and Twitter. I'm Mary Kay Shartle-Galato, Director of the Osher Program at Johns Hopkins University. Thanks for joining us, and we'll see you next time.